right, well, we'll get started. Thank you for joining us today for our Elevate Business HC webinar entitled Human Resources, an Overview of Hiring Practices in the Virtual Age. My name is Victoria Marley, and I'm with the Minneapolis Regional Chamber of Commerce. To get us started here, I'm going to go over just a few housekeeping details. Today, you don't have audio or video, but we do encourage you to put all your questions in the chat bar below. Or even preferably Q&A with the webinar feature that we have today. And then we'll get to those questions after the presentation. Today's webinar is hosted by Sarah Gresham. She's the Senior Recruiting Business Partner for MRA. Valerie Grubry was originally supposed to be here today, but due to illness, we have Sarah joining us. So again, Sarah, thank you so much for being here today. Sarah is an experienced talent management leader with a track record of success in helping organizations solve complex recruitment and retention challenges through integrated strategies for talent acquisition, performance management, rewards, and retention. She is an advocate of future-focused leadership strategy, succession planning, executive coaching, talent pipeline building, and data-driven decision-making. As a talent leader, she helps her clients build the culture needed for success by maintaining a keen focus on talent acquisition and retention, forging strong relationships with staff. Throughout her career, she has demonstrated the ability to transform ideas into specific goal-driven results in response to employees and clients' greatest needs. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Sarah. Thank you so much.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Happy to be here with you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here momentarily. Can everybody see the presentation okay?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you very much for the warm welcome. I am glad to be here, as I said. So just talking kind of on getting into the moment that we're in. Obviously, this has been it goes without saying, a unique time for all of us. It's presented its challenges, and really talking through kind of starting from kind of where we were, where we are, where we're headed, and talk through some best practices as it relates to the virtual hiring, or hiring in a virtual age, if you will. Sorry, my apologies. For some reason, my slides are not advancing, so bear with me. Pardon me. Here we go. There we go. You've heard enough about me, so we'll move on from there. Just a little bit about who MRA is real quickly. We are your total HR resource. We're a member association here located in 4 regions: Iowa, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. Providing HR services, learning and development resources, as well as total rewards, compensation, and then, of course, talent management, to include recruiting, retention, and reference check and background as well. So here are our topics in terms of what we're going to touch on today. So really looking at our new virtual world in recruiting and employee engagement. A lot has changed in the last 8 to 9 months. And then best practices during the candidate experience, and what that recommendations on what that should look like even now. And then talk about communication and branding, and key considerations to show really how to show up looking your best. So talking about some stats, really looking at May to December, and what's changed, what's not changed. But talking about kind of where we were to where we are now, closing in at September on some of our surveys that we completed. So you can take a look at, right kind of almost sort of midway into the pandemic here, we did a hot topic survey talking about recruitment and hiring plans in the next 90 days. I'm certain many of you on the call were probably thinking, I'm not sure how to predict or what to predict, and perhaps maybe you're still in that space. But if you take a look at what our members told us, 41% had decided and determined they were going to recruit for mission critical jobs only, right? So probably hands-on, essential employers. And then also the largest number there, I think, is a big one that sticks out, is really to recruit to retain, right? So 32% said we've really got to recruit to retain and accommodate for any recruiting or any turnover. So really changes to recruitment selection and the onboarding process. We slight changes here, but 10% talked about scripting information for recruiters to address applicants' concerns over job security or workplace safety. Now we're so far into it, that's probably commonplace, I would imagine, as part of that conversation. Do I have to work on site? Is this a remote position? What are you doing to keep me safe, right, in the workplace? And we'll talk a little bit about that. Selection, almost 40% of people back in May had already moved all their interviews to phone or video interviews. And then even conducting final interviews that had previously been done in person to video and voice. So I know even here at MRA, as a best practice, we've been doing that quite a bit as well. So in terms of onboarding, again, back in May, I know that probably seems like a million years ago, but kind of talking about where we were to where we're headed. Moving new employee orientation to a virtual platform, talk about candidate experience, we'll touch on that. And not surprisingly, in May, almost 25% of people said, we don't know, we're not quite sure yet. And then looking into moving ahead into September, talking about MRA's comp trends. 99% of our organizations that were surveyed stated that retaining is either very important or important, as you can see here, and close to about 87% are working hard to attract new talent. So that's, again, even here going into September, how many months into the pandemic, people are still looking at hiring and really focused on employee engagement. So let's talk about candidate and employee engagement. So there's a lot of myths out in the market. One of the ones we hear a lot, with lots of talent available, we can get a great hire for a lower salary, right? I think there's a lot of information going on in the market that's saying, even in the pandemic, people are either being downsized or there's a lot of turnover. But really, if we look at what the facts are based on our research, if employers undercut a candidate's salary requirements, they may leave for a higher salary when the market recovers. So keep those things in mind. Here when we're in the middle of the pandemic, while budget is important, also keeping in mind that if you're talking about retention, we've got vaccines coming out, we've got, hopefully some positive things moving forward here into the future. Be mindful of that when we're talking about hiring in a virtual world. In terms of candidate experience, not keeping in mind that this shouldn't change, right? So start with empathy for the candidate and the hiring team. Always be transparent and clear, and continue to be thinking about the human element. I think sometimes we've become this far into the pandemic so ingrained in, oh, this is the technology, we're going virtual, we're here, but don't lose sight of the human element, right? And even though this is virtual and it might feel like we're moving quickly, make sure that you're still consistent and regular in your communication. I always remind people we're so ingrained right now in the videos and the emails and the voicemails. Don't forget that we still have a telephone. Although that probably is to some an old tool, pick up the phone and call people. Emails are great. It's an efficient way to communicate. I know we use texting tools, but don't forget that conversation is still invaluable, even when we're doing follow-up virtual interviews. In terms of your e-onboarding, we'll talk a little bit about that. Again, that should still have structure, consistency, expectations. I am the candidate. What am I getting? If you just send me an invite and there's no detail, I'm going to have questions, right? That's going to send a message about what your organization is really going to do for me, or how are you going to support me, especially if I'm working remotely. Again, I talked about consistent and regular communication. That is so important, especially now and moving quickly, even more now than ever, right? When we've got essential employers hiring people at the door, they come in and they say, great, can you start now? If you're waiting days to contact people and get back to them, you're going to lose. So again, that's a key thing. And then making sure that your candidate experience is hand in hand with your brand. You know, we might be using different tools to communicate, but what are you saying about your organization? Are you including, we'll talk a little bit about this, about videos about your organization? Are you leveraging the technology that you have access to? All of those tools. One of the things we also talk about is virtual office tours, right? All of those things that, you know, just because they're not there now, maybe you'll have people on site in 3, 4, 5, 6 months. What is their office going to look like? You know, leverage those tools, as well as a realistic job preview. You know, take a video of what they might be doing on a daily basis. Show them the shop floor. You know, show them what their expectation is, or just send them a picture of a fellow employee in PPE and what it looks like. You know, we're doing so much remotely and virtually, people still want to know what to expect. And really those candidate experience touch points, again, I mentioned, you know, video interviews is a great way to engage. The video process, you know, update this often because it changes. I think we even talked about as we were getting our meeting started today, the technology updates, especially now we become so comfortable with this video format that sometimes we forget, oh, we need to double check, or we need to make sure there hasn't been an update. Again, all of those things are key to a candidate's experience. Pre-hire assessments, that's a great way right now to continue another touch point, another step to engage your candidates. Again, don't forget and don't skip steps in the process. And really continuing to enable those effective virtual interviews. You know, making sure the people that are doing the interviewing are comfortable with the platform and the technology. You know, an interview should never feel like a test, right? You're going in, it should feel like you're asking good questions, you're prepared with questions, you're level setting expectations for the candidate, but don't make them walk away feeling like they're tested, unless, of course, that's already set up as part of the expectation, or I'm sending you an assessment, or I'm sending you this ahead of time. Interview agenda, that's, again, one that may sound easy, but again, sending more than just a Zoom or a Teams link, right? Continue, send the agenda, give them the detail. Let them know what to expect. You know, it might be a different platform, but I'm still going to want to know, who am I meeting with? What am I going to be expected to speak to? Make sure they feel prepared. Make sure they have the link. You know, take a few minutes beforehand, especially if you're scheduling the interview with a hiring manager. Call the candidate. Say, do you have any questions? You know, you want them to feel like they're set up for success too. Were you able to open the technology? Do you have what you need? Again, still focusing on that behavioral based interview. Again, make it conversational, engage, especially in the video format. You know, I'm hopeful that 9 months in, you know, most of us have had the experience to use video technology. They're becoming more comfortable with it. But just because you're on video doesn't mean we don't want to be personable and we don't want to be engaging. I mentioned again that virtual job shadow. A great way to send a quick video link. We all walk around with phones in our pockets. We have access to YouTube, or quite frankly, we have video on our phones now. Send them a quick video. Say, here's our office. Welcome to where you might be in 6 months. Or here's an example of what your day might look like. You know, walk them through an office. It doesn't have to be perfect. You know, you don't need to go hire a video crew. But those are great tools. And we actually have some tools available where we can record those for you. And candidate feedback and evaluation, again, you know, we're doing things, we're engaging people differently, but so critical and so important. I can't tell you how many times I tell people, oh, I heard from a candidate, I applied for that job and I had never heard anything. Or I've interviewed over the last 6 months and I thought I had a great video interview, but then I never heard anything. Right? And what does that message say about your organization? That has not changed. Our platform, our environment might be different. We might be working from home, but that's so key. If people are, so talking about another myth or fact, one of the myths we like to talk about is people are currently employed. They are not looking for jobs right now. I can tell you that is not true. So I talk with people are looking. Many are at home and are able to connect with recruiters really now more than ever before. Think about it, right? I'm no longer sitting in my cube. If a recruiter says, hey, can you talk over your lunch hour? Yes, I can, because I'm at my kitchen table and my boss isn't going to know who I'm talking to, right? So differently accessible than they were before. When we were all in offices and maybe didn't have feel like we had the flexibility that we might have had in terms of communicating. As I mentioned, know your technology and leverage it. We talked a little bit about earlier, the virtual onboarding, the preparedness. Make sure you have a plan, prepare your best practices, and make sure you share those with your hiring managers. Because keeping in mind, if you're an organization that hasn't hired for a while and you're in a region or a state where you're on lockdown or you're at stay at home, your manager might not have interviewed, right, for the last 6 months or prior. So they are not, interviewing is not their expertise, but now you're asking them to do a virtual interview, something they may never have done before. So making sure you're leveraging your technology, but making sure you're making sure your hiring managers feel good and are prepared as well. The email is another great way. Again, as I talked about, the phone, don't let go of the opportunity to pick up the phone. But making sure your emails still remain confident or conversation as well. Now, I'm not suggesting you want to put a ton of emojis in there and go overboard, when you're communicating, but show your personality a little bit, be professional, be concise, but really think about leaving that lasting impression. That's really what we look at as part of the consulting process. Show your personality a little bit in your communication. Obviously know your organization, know your compliance, but that's a great way to continue to, engage the conversation and make it more personal. Social media, of course, is a tremendous way to engage candidates, especially now when they have different accessibility. Obviously people are at home and they're focused and they're working. But, again, on my lunch hour, I'm working from home. I might have more opportunity to check a Facebook post or reaching out to me on LinkedIn differently than I may have had, where I was sitting in my offices. It's a great way to build the pipeline too. A different way to communicate. Think about Facebook as well as meetup groups. A lot of recruiters that I'm talking to, myself included, another great way to build a pipeline is use groups, meetups. If you're not familiar, it's a platform, especially right now, it's been fairly active. Before the pandemic, individuals would form groups as everything from I'm running a running group to a reading group to a gardening group, and I'll meet you at the gardening plot or I'll meet you at the coffee shop and we'll go run from there. Well, now it's become virtual, and so they're talking, right? So if you're hiring an engineer, maybe you can look up, there's a meetup group for engineers or a meetup group for HR professionals. They're still engaged and they're still communicating. So be creative, right? Differently in how we would go to find candidates as well. Different than in, for example, physical places. Again, this should not change. Treating candidates with respect kind of seems like a no-brainer. But as I shared, some hiring managers are either not prepared or not comfortable. And sometimes, they unknowingly may do something that comes off as disrespectful, right, to a candidate. I was recently shared a story with a friend of mine who went in for an interview, and it was an on-site interview because it was manufacturing. He was taken to a conference room by the HR leader and was left there and was told somebody would come back to get him and meet him, i.e. the hiring manager, to speak with him or take him through the interview process. Well, he was sitting there and he says, okay, well, 5 minutes, maybe somebody is a little late. Okay. Well, that went to 5 to 20 to 15 or to 20 to 25 to 30 to 45 minutes. He was sitting alone with a mask on in a conference room. And again, wherever the miscommunication happened, he said, I hated to do it, but I had to leave. I was there on my lunch hour expecting that I was going to meet with somebody. for a half-hour conversation and then get back to work. So again, what's the process? What are the expectations? Maybe that just means that you're setting that clear, you send them an agenda. HR manager is going to put them in conference room A, socially distanced, don't sit, 6, as we're talking, right? The reality, 6 feet apart. And then at 12:05, Bob's supervisor or Jane's supervisor is going to come and grab you, and we're going to go from there, right? So again, and he has no desire to go back to that company nor work there. Can you imagine? Setting realistic expectations, that kind of goes along that right line, right? How long will the interview be? Again, with timing, especially if you're talking about on-site interviews, making sure they're comfortable. Are you practicing social distance? And are you providing PPE, or are you expecting them? Are you taking a temperature at the door? What are the things, what can I expect, right? And let them know that the time, and also make sure your hiring managers, again, now more important than ever, are meeting that time. Because if you're doing a virtual interview, and we're talking about candidates who have different access to you, right? They might be working from home. They might have squeezed in literally 30 minutes to have a conversation on a video meeting. You get a hiring manager in that platform and they are just going way over. The candidate is then in an awkward situation. Perhaps maybe they're late for another video meeting. I mean, all of these things need to still be in place. And again, still making hiring a priority, right? We've got so many things going on right now. Sometimes this is a tough one for hiring managers. I did a round table yesterday, and we were talking about planning and hiring into 2021. And that was one of the topics that came up. Sometimes I think hiring managers forget, those of us sometimes, depending on what our jobs are, it's got to be a priority, right? Getting our hiring managers engaged, stick with them, follow up with them, show them your value, communicate, even if it's a quick 15-minute call each week, let them know where you're at. And it might also mean being that realistic, or sometimes I like to say peeling the onion back and saying, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do in terms of the process, here's what's accessible, here's what's not. So being realistic, but still making hiring a priority. Again, the communicate effectively, as I mentioned, as in all the time, right? So we might be working from home, we might be feeling a little more isolated, but that doesn't prevent us from, again, that quick personable email, a quick 15-minute touch base, and of course, always that phone call. And then, again, continuing to keep same thing, communicate with your candidates regularly, often, make it personable, continue to keep them engaged. And then, of course, be on time. That sounds like a silly thing, and an obvious thing, but that's still a big deal, as I mentioned, with people maybe having tighter schedules. Again, talking about candidates, really challenging the candidate as well. Have good questions, be prepared. Make sure you have engaging questions prepared for the hiring managers, and yourself included. As mentioned, give an inside view of your culture. Do you have video testimonies? I talked about that earlier. What are you sharing? Give them a realistic preview of what goes on in your organization. If the reality is, look, I'm working from home, here's my home office, here's ideally, the environment that we'd like for you to be in, all of those things, but let them see what it's like. Another great way to engage is, I've seen companies even through the onboarding and hiring, is engage them in a virtual happy hour. Maybe they haven't been hired yet, but you want them to meet some of your colleagues. Hey, can you join us for a virtual happy hour at 4:30? It's just a quick 15 to 30 minute hi, grab a cocktail of your choice at home, and get to know us a little bit. Bring your questions. We'd love to get to meet you. So a little bit different, but a great way to engage a candidate. And then, as mentioned, be proactive about giving feedback. Sorry about that. So again, keeping your candidates warm, engaging them differently, maybe you invite them to a virtual team meeting if it's appropriate, all of those things to differently engage them that we might not be thinking about if we were following that typical process of phone interview, yep, come in for an in-person interview. I've asked you all the questions, I've sent you all the assessments, and we're done, right? So how are we differently engaging our candidates? One of the other myths that we like to share is unemployment is so high, employers are in control. Those of you on the call might agree, right? The fact is the market recovers, continues to recover, candidates will be even more choosy than before, right? So they know what's been out there. Perhaps they were downsized by a different opportunity or organization, and now they're saying, you know what, I don't want that anymore. I want to pick and choose. I have my priorities. Really, and we talk about 4 steps to candidate success. You know, don't be afraid to customize your message. Know the career paths. You know, what's in it for the candidate? Do you have that? You know, if I'm coming in as an associate, how long might it take me? You know, or on the other side of that, you know, our organization's kind of flat. You might get great opportunity, but no, you're not going to be a vice president in 6 months. That's just not our structure. But making sure you set that up front. You know, listen twice as much as you talk, right? That's a thing I think when you're in a virtual platform, that kind of feels weird for me to say right now because that's what I'm doing, talking at everybody here this morning. But really be that listener, you know, find out what they want. Is it career advancement? Ask them what that means. Don't assume you know what that means. For some people, as I mentioned earlier, it's title. For some people, it might mean I want different and unique projects. I don't want to be doing the same thing. I don't care what you call me, but I want to feel engaged and I want exciting work to do. Again, listen. Listen more than you talk. You might be surprised by the response. And then really, what can go wrong? You know, you think about the negative human impacts. You know, we have to work a bit harder really to ensure our candidates, as I'm mentioning here this morning, are receiving that personal touch, really, even in a virtual world, right? It's a big change to go from shaking hands, right, to sitting in a room across the table. And really sometimes having to make a hiring decision without even meeting someone, right? So, you know, how does that feel? But making sure that you've made it a positive experience, you've used the tools to provide an engaged experience, even if you don't end up hiring that person. So they walk away feeling like, you know what, okay, that didn't work out, but I might come back to them in 6 months versus being left alone in a conference room for 45 minutes and having to leave because you had to get back to work. So again, that's kind of an extreme example, but imagine, you know, that's an experience, right? And being mindful, you know, our hiring managers are struggling, right? You know, they're struggling with all kinds of, we can only imagine, COVID and lack of staff and all these other things that they're doing. You know, be respectful of that, be supportive, you know, and understand that sometimes our candidates don't always have access to the technology that we assume they do. So again, how are we engaging them? You know, how are we getting them involved in the process? You know, the reality is ghosting, you know, comes from a dating term I learned a few years ago, but, you know, that's the truth. You know, what can go wrong? The fallout rates. We're seeing that more and more, right? We say, yep, be here Tuesday, bingo, nobody, you know, where'd they go? Or interviews, you know, so you've got to be mindful of that. And then again, the lack of access to reliable technology. You know, some of us become so accustomed in these platforms. Not everybody that we're trying to recruit has access to that, right? So how are we trying to engage them differently, and make sure that, you know, you are willing to work with candidates and how you can and be flexible. I had one member who, again, while it's simple, was in a clinical environment, and their infection control nurse said, absolutely, no one is coming in here. I don't care how bad we need people. And so she got creative. She set up a tent on the back porch, got a heater, set chairs 6 feet apart, and said, hey, can you come and meet me on the back porch? You won't have to go inside. We'll sit outside with masks. You and I can sit down 6 feet apart and we can have a discussion, right? Sounds simple, but a great way to engage people. So talking about pre-boarding and onboarding, again, It starts way before day one. You know, what are the impression that you're giving? Are you being consistent in your messaging? How did you reach out to them? How are you engaging them? It starts before you even really schedule that interview. What does your messaging look like? Have you been engaging? You know, a lot of us talk about how long does pre-boarding and onboarding last? You know, some people say 30, 60, 90 days. It takes as long as it needs to take. You know, it may take the entire business cycle, right? An entire year, depending on what your fiscal. Don't assume that at 90 days you've done your job, right? They might have completed and checked the boxes off of things at 90 days, but that doesn't mean that onboarding is done, right? And that leads us to, you know, culture assimilation. You know, we might be making assumptions about still, I've told you, I've given you everything you need, I've given you the PPE, you should be fine. That doesn't mean that they're going to assimilate in your culture. They have the tools to do the job. How are you continuing to engage people differently? You know, are you having those, as I mentioned, virtual happy hours? Or if you're a manufacturing company, you know, how are you differently engaging? Well, you can't eat in the lunchroom, but maybe you're providing a box lunch once a week. You know, what are you doing with these folks? Micro-learning is another great way to keep people engaged. You know, time, especially for the essential employers, you know, there might not be a lot of extra time, but micro-learnings are a great way to help with that onboarding. It's a really kind of a flash training, 15 to 25 minutes of content that can be broken up over different periods of time. So one, you're not overwhelming somebody with all day long of training and going, my head is going to explode. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with all that information. To, oh, also, I understand it, but now there's I'm maybe as an employee, I'm looking forward to another little break. Or you as the HR manager or hiring leader, now you have multiple opportunities to continue to engage through these micro learnings. And then again, that personalization, we really need to continue to personalize the onboarding, right? So if you learn something about an employee or they volunteer something, or you know that they perhaps have shared they like a certain candy or whatever that might be, but it might not be specific to the same person, as I said to that, but making sure you're customizing it as appropriate. You know, we're not in a one size fits all onboarding. You know, maybe somebody does have all day long to do based on their schedule to do the onboarding, but then another person, it might work better to do those micro learnings. And making sure you know who owns it, right? Have a plan, have a schedule. You might own part of it as the hiring leader or the HR person, but then where does it go from there? And what is the employee going to be expecting, right? Who owns it? And then talking about employee engagement, what employees want, right? Especially now, we talk a lot about diversity and inclusion, as well as really that sense of belonging, right? How am I going to fit into this culture? And what are you doing to engage your employees? You know, we can't forget the part about, you know, whether it's through a micro learning or multi-engagement, or if it's appropriate, a quick text, if a week, a couple weeks in, how are you doing? How's it going? What can I do? What can I help you with? But really, that's an opportunity to not only continue to engage, but also elevate your brand. You know, my brand is at my company, I take care of my employees, even in the pandemic, or even more so than the pandemic. And then really talking about your brand equals your reputation, right? So now more than ever, when people are going online, they're looking at information, what are you doing and what are you saying, right? Do you have a COVID-19 update page? Maybe you don't have the capacity to do an entire website, but you can put a PDF out there and that can be updated, right? So use your resources. Really thinking about still, again, now more than ever, with people having time to look or really looking or having choices, you know, working to craft your career page for the candidate, not the customer. A lot of times we go to a company and I click on the career page and the first thing it leads is, we have the best generators, blah, blah, blah. That's great. I want to work for a company that sells a reputable company, but what's in it for me? Where are your values? What am I going to get? Professional development, training, a free lunch, whatever it might be, right? And again, level setting expectations, letting them know what to expect. You know, if you are an essential employer, yeah, you need to be here. I need you to be here in the plant. This is not a remote position, right? Be consistent in your messaging. Again, if you're updating or you're expecting an update, again, making sure that messaging is consistent. If you have the luxury or the opportunity, do partner with marketing. You know, they're creative. They can come up with great opportunities to help you create that employee value proposition. Working on, again, what's in it for me as the candidate. Again, now more than ever, you know, what are you doing to keep me safe? Am I expected to come into the office, or can I work remotely? Or am I working remotely for the first 6 months and then I'm going to be expected to come back into the office, right? And that just really goes to talking about the new way of work, showing them you have a plan, letting them know, you know, yes, you know, we've had individuals that we've hired that have committed and understand that in 6 months they're going to be in the office. They might live an hour and a half away from the office now, but they've already communicated, nope, I'm in the process of relocating, I'm moving closer to the office. I understand that's a future expectation. But again, and there's that piece of showcasing your organization, what they're doing to support your employees right now. Important just to note around that employee brand, job seekers, 60% of job seekers would accept a lower salary if the company has positive reviews online. So really talking about going from your career page to your job postings to where people are getting information on your company. Watch that, follow that, right? Especially if you've been impacted by the pandemic. Perhaps you've had to, you know, you were involved in a RIF or a layoff. What are employees saying? You know, perhaps it, you know, that happens and it's okay. But how did you handle that, and how did you manage that for the employees? The employees consider leaving. 84% of employers consider leaving their current jobs for a company with a better reputation. And then, you know, talking about one of the largest growing groups in the workforce, the millennials, believe that being a part of the right company culture is important, right? So what are you socially conscious, or what's going on within your organization? And really talking about why that brand is important. Again, now more than ever, we can retain good employees, employee engagement, reduce cost, right? Turnover, if people want to stay. You can really talk about decreasing time to fill. Candidates are engaged. You get your organization to a place where people are coming to you, right? What a great thing. You know, an opportunity to humanize, as I mentioned, your company as an employer. What do we do for our employees? You know, maybe we're not in the offices, but we've chosen to support a particular cause who's being impacted by the pandemic. You know, is that appropriate? But talk about those things. And then be transparent about your employee brand and what you do have to offer your employees. And maybe it's changed. You know, maybe temporarily you've reduced benefits. Maybe you have to overcompensate that, you've reduced benefits from a cost, but you've added vacation. Whatever that might be, make sure they know that up front. And really those key components to the brand is really, again, know your employer value proposition. Why do you work there? Do you have one? Why do people want to be a part of this organization? Look at your career page. Make sure you're selling the job, not the product. Make sure you're using job advertisements, not job descriptions. I know you've all heard this, but even now when we perhaps maybe have more access to screen time, more downtime, more people are at home, more time to look at jobs, you know what? If your job is too long and too lengthy, they're going on to the next one. So the culture and the core values, again, are key components. I'll talk a little bit about employer advocacy, and then your company reviews online, and then of course that social media. But really the key components quickly here about the employer value proposition. Don't be afraid to share your social elements of work, as I mentioned, right? So what are you doing differently? Maybe it's a virtual happy hour, or you're a socially conscious organization, or your social element is we have Friday hours, or whatever that might be. What does that look like now? Make sure you're talking about the interesting and challenging work tasks. Again, we talked about earlier, right? If I'm an employee, I might not necessarily see career development or career advancement as you promoting me or changing my title, but what are you going to do for me and what's unique and interesting about your organization? To the extent of which my skills can be applied in meaningful ways. I was recently working with a pharmaceutical company, for example, and yes, it might all sound very scientific and I'm at a loss for words. However, but what they were doing is they were really making an impact because they were taking formulas and creating drugs that saved the lives of others, right? That to me is very meaningful work. Yeah, there's some very specific scientific requirements and skills, but how do you tie that in to your value proposition? Again, those opportunities for professional development I mentioned earlier, listen more, talk less, find out what the candidates really are looking for from a recruiting and retention perspective. Are there economic issues tied to compensation? Be transparent about that. At this point in time, we've reduced our wage too. I know I mentioned, don't be paying less people paying less intentionally as part of our fact or myths that we talked about. But maybe that's where you're at right now, or maybe temporarily you've had to reduce or eliminate your bonus program, but the intent is to bring it back. Let them know that up front. And then really, again, what is the role of management, whether it be in the interview process, the leadership process? What are managers expected to do within your organization and from an employee engagement perspective? And then what about work-life balance? Is that something you talk about? Is that realistic? Is that something that you offer? Or what does that look like? Or your work-life balance is the reality. We are a 24-hour operation. We run 2 12-hour shifts. That's it, right? Okay, that balance looks different at different organizations. Again, as I mentioned earlier, be active with that employee brand, and review your employer sites, look at your social media, don't forget about that career page. And then really, again, don't forget what makes your organization unique. What is different? What makes you different than the bank down the street? If you're a bank, what's different? What's unique about your culture differently than the organization down the street? Again, the stakeholders, even in a virtual environment, really partner with your hiring leaders and marketing to communicate what you're doing for your candidates and employees. Be transparent, be consistent, listen. This is not just a responsibility of the recruiter and HR. All leaders within your organization are stakeholders. I talk about my poor friend Mike that got left in a conference room. That was on the hiring manager. I mean, one could assume, right? Or maybe it was on the HR. There was lack of communication. But again, the stakeholders, what's the process? How are we involved? And really having everybody involved in the culture of the organization. Again, keeping mindful of purposeful best practices. As I mentioned with onboarding, have a plan, be purposeful. One size doesn't always fit all, but really making sure you have a plan, but yet keeping it simple. Don't overcomplicate it. Go ahead and customize communication. As I mentioned, even when your emails, be bold and have open conversations. Hey, we're all learning right now. If it's not working, go back and change it. Make an improvement. Maybe one platform isn't working. Okay, maybe do we have the opportunity to change it? But build that into every step of your process, being purposeful and being consistent in your practices. Be able to change with the moment. I mean, that goes without saying at month 9, almost 10, here we are in the pandemic. Change, right? Change with the moment. Change your process. Maybe you have to get somebody else involved. And really looking into the future. I think all of us right now in the pandemic are thinking, oh, thank goodness, it's about to be 2021. I could put 2020 in the background. But really, think about dear past, thank you for all the lessons, and dear future, I'm ready. So any last minute questions that you have for me?
Well, thank you, Sarah. Yeah, it looks like we've got a number of questions coming in. And please do put your questions in the Q&A or chat. So So one of the questions is ghosting applicants was something that happened in the real world before the pandemic. You mentioned how important it is to provide feedback and evaluation. How do you suggest best to do that?
So there's a number of different ways. I mean, there's tools. Again, there's I guess I'm understanding that. Is that a two-part question? Is that about ghosting, or is that providing feedback?
I think providing the feedback from the applicants and.
Okay. I think, again, a great way to do that. I know I do a lot of times. I will, depending on knowing the person's schedule, craft a very respectful email, letting them know that, we've chosen a different candidate for this particular time. And really, again, still in this environment, the phone, don't hesitate to pick up the phone and just thank them very much for their experience, their opportunity to meet the team, and let them know. And even now in this environment, one of the things that I've done over the last 6 to 8 months is when I've had people who I've interviewed who you could tell were very nervous on video or weren't comfortable, I will provide that feedback. Be honest, like I said, be transparent and let them know, gosh, you know what, you've had really good questions, but you seem a little nervous. I might recommend that you maybe practice talking to yourself into your cell phone, or practice talking into a mirror so that feels more natural and more comfortable as you continue to do virtual interviews.
Another question that came in is, now with, the COVID, everything is based on technology. What do you suggest for employers, for those applicants that maybe don't have access to technology? What kind of, new aspects should we incorporate?
Yeah, so when you're talking about technology being computers, laptops, those kind of things, I err on the side of, I think most of the candidates that I work with at least have access to a cell phone. And so, texting tools is a great way. I don't advocate for people using a personal cell phone, but if you have a cell phone, a lot of the applicant tracking systems now, even have chat bots that can be done on a phone through an app, as well as texting applications. We use one through our vendor called Modern Hire, which is a great way to blast out either feedback on interviews as well as to reach candidates. Now, granted, I know you have to have a phone number and able to do that. But that's a great way to continue to engage people, is even that texting on the phone.
Yeah, right. I didn't even think about that. Yeah, even just your cell phone can be that technology tool.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be something that's a formal laptop or other device. Let's see. Other question. Love the idea of a virtual job shadow or introducing the potential coworkers. What tips do you have to make sure that that is in fact a helpful process and not the opposite?
Yep, absolutely. So I always, I don't recommend too many cooks in the kitchen, but even when I talk about this in some of the recruiting classes I train, make sure you understand the message that you want to have. So almost think of it like, I encourage you to even set up kind of a, not necessarily, but a loose script. What do you want to cover? What do you want the candidate to see? Who do you want to be involved? Now, realistic is key here. I'm not suggesting you falsify or, scrub the floor in the manufacturing plant if it's in fact kind of a dirty environment. That's important for people to see. But then also when I was mentioning, I don't recommend having everybody involved, but if you're an organization that's adherent to safety and compliance or HIPAA, just make sure that if that's the case, that's fine. Go and show them the hospital room, show them their work environment, but make sure there's no patients in the background. There's no, this all sounds very obvious, but those are all things that, could potentially go wrong. And don't overcomplicate it. I've seen them even, hi, my name is Sarah. I work at MRA. Come and join me as I walk down the hallway into our cafe. And so it might even just be one person who's volunteering to do a quick little intro and welcome to my lobby. And I love working here because, so it could be that simple.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, absolutely. It's with all the HIPAA, there is those regulations, but it's great to, just the basics is so important too. Let's see. Another question is, For smaller businesses who might not have an HR department, what are the key components do you recommend for those who are just kind of doing it on their own?
Yep. So I would still, if you're doing it on your own, have a consistent process. Think about if operationally or you have other parts of your role, take a few moments to write a quick SOP. Here's what our recruiting process looks like as an organization. We might be small and mighty, but the first thing is I'm going to call the person. I'm going to ask them these first 5 questions to include, maybe it's, again, if you're compliant, is it education? Is it pay? What does that look like? The next step is I'm going to then bring them in for a social distance interview, or we're then going to schedule. So again, just get back to the basics, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what are the steps? And so everybody knows what to do, how to follow them, even if you're working outside of an HR department, because that really helps that candidate experience, especially if you're small. But also if you're with a smaller organization, I think that's even an opportunity, in my opinion, to be a little bit more informal, if that's your culture. So, invite them again to that. If you do a virtual happy hour, if that's your organization, maybe you only have 7 people, hey, come and meet us. What do you think about our organization? You want to come and see us on Friday at 4:30? You bring your tea, your coffee, or whatever your alcoholic beverage of choice, and come join us, come talk to us, see what you think of our organization.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. You brought that up earlier, and that was one of the things that I thought too was, oh my gosh, now with it being so virtual, that is something that you can do, and the applicants then can really get a better sense of the culture, and that, because that is really, in my mind too, a big piece for employees to stick around and to stay, retained for their businesses. See, one more question. Please do keep putting in your questions. We used to hear that if employees worked remotely, kind of put them in a pool to not for promotions or advancements. Have you seen in your, is that the case still? Or what is the new normal with that?
So if I'm understanding the question correctly, those people that perhaps are feeling like
worked remotely, who now, because everyone's working remotely. Yeah. But in the past, if you were someone who was working remotely, that would really kind of, put you out of the pool for promotions or advancement. You're kind of looked on as, someone kind of out of the picture. But is that still the case, or is that something now where, everyone's more on an equal playing field?
That's a really great question, but I think that really depends on the culture of the organization. Is it, while that sounds kind of maybe an easy way to answer the question, but it's truthful. I mean, this week I was talking with a credit union, and their culture was very in the office, behind the desk, very much. Well, they're a smaller credit union. They have about, by comparison, about 400 employees. Almost 200 of them are working remotely right now. So that was a big shift. And so then to keep that level of engagement. So, I think that in my humble opinion is, I think it is getting better because we are working remotely and we are doing our best to keep people engaged, through virtual meetings. But you as employers, there's opportunity to stay engaged too. Just because you're working remotely doesn't mean you can't insert yourself and say, or encourage your employees to say, why don't you schedule a 15-minute touch base with your leader each week? Get on their radar, don't, just because you're working remotely, I would encourage you to tell your teams, insert yourself. What are you doing? Get on their radar screen, and help to maybe change that culture. But fundamentally, I think there's still organizations we work with, this remote thing is very temporary in their minds. And you just need to be getting ready to get back to work. So it really does. I think it depends on the culture of the organization.
It's very interesting, yeah, that there is that difference between, different companies and what the culture is still. Well, let's see, looks like that kind of wraps up the questions. Sarah, thank you so much. This has been just really interesting in terms of hearing what some of the new practices are with COVID in the virtual world. But honestly, a lot of it has just been things to kind of keep in mind on an ongoing basis. Listening to the candidates and, just inviting them in to get that culture read before a hiring process. So, and following up and the no ghosting and all those things that it was, it just fun to hear that that's still kind of a common issue. So things to kind of keep in mind for the future, but also kind of all the new components too to kind of think about too. So again, Sarah, thank you so much for joining us today. And we love MRA has been a member of Minneapolis Chamber for a number of years, and we love having you as our host today. So thank you so much. And tomorrow we have another Elevate Business HC webinar. We look forward to having many of you join us for that one as well. Thanks so much, Sarah, and I'll sign off. Thank you.
All. Glad to be here. Have a great day.